This is the audio version of the soundbox for the 5th of November 2020. If you're using this, I'd just like to point out that this won't have the discussion which will happen in the class, but I'll make sure that I try and cover the framework of what we are exploring. If you have any questions or ideas which follow from the audio, please do follow them up. I'll try and make sure that some of the visual material is lined up with the film so you don't miss out too much. But I apologize that this is going to be a little bit bare compared to the session in the class. So what I'd like to do today is explore the output, a limited view on the output of one of the great living composers in the UK, Simon Bainbridge. I'm going to take a view on 3 works of string quartet and 1 for string quartet and clarinet. And these works date from the very beginning of his professional life as a composer right to a work written fairly recently, which in some ways came to public life last year, as will become clear. One of the things I want to explore is how, when we look at the output of any composer or any artist of any period, and we look at it with respect for and disrespect for time, how themes and ideas can be seen appearing when a composer is young, being tried out across their work, or reappearing quite late, and how we as performers and listeners can sort of trace those, use those to find their way into the composer's mind and the word I always use far too much, the composer's workshop. So this, I will reiterate the thing which I say far too often, which is that I'm convinced as a performer that composers are hiding something from me, and that what I'm doing as a performer is trying to reveal as much as possible in the playing of their music what they might or might not be hiding, or what they might or might not want to reveal. So the other thing with this is I'd like to say this is a celebration in many ways of a composer's extraordinary contribution to chamber music, and it's a kind of gesture of admiration from my point of view, as someone who's been very lucky to work closely with him at various times over many years, and so it's an opportunity to explore some aspects, to celebrate him effectively by giving his music the close attention it deserves. I first met and worked with Simon when I was in my early 20s. We worked very intensely then. And then this, of course, naturally, when he was head of composition at the Academy, then I worked with him in a different context then. And then we reanimated our collaboration 2.5 years ago in the exploration of these pieces. And that kind of reflowering was something which is the stimulus for this talk. It resulted in public performances, very intense workshops, and a recording which is just about to be released. The pictures you're seeing are from work at his house. The 6th person in the picture is the clarinetist Linda Merrick, who's the principal of the Royal Northern College of Music, who's been collaborating with my quartet, the Kreutzer Quartet, for many years on clarinet quintets, both commissioned for us and going into works which have been neglected. Our collaboration began, if you like, on rather a high with an extraordinary quintet from John McCabe, and since then people who've written for us in collaboration with her have included Michael Finnessy. The other members of the quartet you're seeing there, and at various times I think their voices are going to be heard in the ideas around what I'm talking about today, are the second violinist of the quartet, who's also a composer, Mihailo Trantofilovsky, Neil Hyder, who you'll know, and the violist Clifton Harrison. So I'd like to begin with the first string quartet. This is a pretty rare example of an early work by a composer of the 20th and 21st century, which springs into being with complete accomplishment. You can say with quite a few composers that their early works are very exciting or brilliant, such as the early works of a composer who we admire hugely, Peter Maxwell Davies. His teenage string quartets are very exciting, but they don't have that much to do with what he was going to do later. Whereas what's exciting about this quartet, which was commissioned by the old Greater London Council, the GLC, in 1972, this quartet speaks volumes to what were going to be Bainbridge's interests and ideas over the ensuing decades. It was commissioned and dedicated to, the idea of the commission for Andre Previn, who at that time was the incredibly influential and celebrated conductor of the London Symphony Orchestra. As I don't think there's been a conductor since who enjoyed the degree of celebrity in the UK, which Previn did. And if you're British, you're being brought up on his famous appearance on the Morecambe and Wise show, with the two comedians massacring the Grieg piano concerto with the LSO laughing behind. But Previn was somebody who was, it's difficult to talk about him in the past, an extraordinarily musical omnivore. And as part of the festival he'd founded, the South Bank Summer Music Festival, this always included a workshop. And the workshop wasn't an informal thing. The workshop was a place where new music could be presented at a very high level. And the result was that the quartet was premiered by the very acclaimed Yale Quartet. One of the members of the Yale Quartet was Walter Trampler, a great viola player. And it's worth saying that by the time the score of this quartet, its exquisite score, was published in 1974, the score itself notes that the composer was already collaborating with Trampler on the viola concerto, which would be first premiered in 1976, and which was going to make his name. Trampler was, at that point, a viola player who enjoyed the kind of public acclaim that, say, in the 1990s and early thousands, Yuri Bashmirt would enjoy, and not only commissioned but championed an extraordinarily broad range of solo works, working, for instance, very closely with Hans Werner Henze, though the viola concerto of Henze was not written for him. But the Yale Quartet was an extraordinary collection, and particularly the first violin, Broadus Earl, and the cellist, Aldo Pariso. At the time of the premiere of this quartet in 1972 by the Yale Quartet, the second violinist was Yoko Matsuda. It's also worth pointing out that Walter Trampler and Broadus Earl had real, if you like, real investment in the performance of new music. They'd founded the New Music Quartet some decades earlier, but at this point there wasn't really a thing in the US of quartets specializing in new music. It's worth remembering, of course, that the arrival of the Kronos Quartet, into the public eye anyway, at the end of the 1980s, was not particularly a watershed moment in terms of new music quartets, because, of course, in the 1960s, the quartet which was making the running was the La Salle Quartet, whose work will feature in my discussion a little bit. So the expectation of a quartet being a new music quartet, as we know today from things like the Ardita Quartet and the Jack Quartet, for instance, was something rather new. It's worth saying that it's not something which is of terrible great interest to us, the Kreutzer Quartet, as a group. We have always, both as a quartet and as individual players, collaborated intensively with living composers, but much of our work with living composers has been in dialogue with the fact that we are people who are fascinated with and play huge amounts of music, both well-known and rare, from all periods. So an example would be Neil Haider is internationally acclaimed for his work on Claude Debussy, and Clifton Harrison for his work on mid-century, 20th century American composers, particularly black women composers. So that kind of specialization is not something that interests us that much. And it's worth saying right now that in our conversations with Bainbridge about his works, what was most fascinating was, particularly with the second quartet and the Clarinet Quintet, how much of the way he invited us to shape these very complex scores related far more, for instance, to, say, the work of Wagner or, say, the late symphonies of Anton Bruckner, than talking that much about late 20th or early 21st century. But it is worth saying that when the piece appeared in 1972, and I know that Simon wouldn't mind me saying this, it's clear that there were things out there which were directly affecting him. And it's worth saying that one thing that cannot be overemphasized at this point is that if there's an essential difference between the way that adventurous musicians found their way to music when I was a young musician at the end of the 80s, for instance, and in the previous decade, and the way they do it now, is that, and this lasted really until the mid-90s, when certain facilities became, yes, less accessible, that we spent most of our time hunting music down on the shelf from the shelf more than we hunted music down in recorded or video form or online. Now, there's a reason I want to bring this up, which is that meant that one of the most important things was for instance, just table libraries for a moment, but just speaking to the relationship to publishers, it meant that publishers were very concerned to make sure that young musicians, whether they were composers or players interested in new music, for instance, had access as much as possible to the scores which might be interesting to us, because we might, and they're interesting to them as publishers because we might play them, which meant that I certainly built my collection of late 20th century music from basically being badgered by promotion departments of music publishers, encouraging me to look at things. And in the case of young composers, this was clearly happening as well. I know from talking with many people that all of us can give these names of extraordinary people who were responsible for pushing the music of one person into the hands of another. And so, for instance, these would include people such as, and these names won't really mean anything to you, names such as Sheila McCrindle, who worked at what used to be Chester Music before it was assimilated in what would become known as Music Sales. An extraordinary, at that time, young woman at Schott Verlag, Schott & Co., Sir Charles Grove's daughter, Sally Groves, who was and still is a live wire of energy, of encouraging people to keep their noses to the grindstone with new music. And also people such as Jane Williams. And so in my case, much of my introduction to these composers came from those people. And so it was. My introduction to Simon came through a promotion department. To one of two things: either they send you scores, or they'd say, "Would you like to come and meet this person?" You'd be put together with them. The reason I'm talking about this a great deal is because it means that even though certain scores of new music in the early 70s were not finding their way into libraries because lending libraries couldn't get their hands on them because they would have been higher only at that point, I knew a decade and a half later, but it was known that you could go, you spent a great deal of time in the back rooms and cellars of the music publishers going through new stuff and very old stuff. And the other thing is, which is not fashionable now, we all memorized the lists of what publishers were publishing what for our combinations of instruments we were interested in or the instruments that we played. So many pieces of music I knew about, I knew their scoring, I had an idea of their length and the year they were composed, and I often got excited about the title. I would memorize them from lists long before I ever heard them or got to play them. Back to Simon. So the question is, in 1972, if you think of the opening of this piece, which I do, or any part of this piece, I do encourage you to go and listen to, and perhaps it might be an idea now to pause this and then go to the first YouTube link and have listened to it. So it's all in one. So the YouTube link is I've provided it to you. So you go and listen to the first thing, the quartet, which is about 12 minutes long, and you can listen to some of it or all of it. But there's some aspects of this quartet which clearly come from two other works. Now, the very first of them, which is audible right from the very beginning, is Ligeti's second quartet, which has an absolute oral relationship, first of all, to the opening of Ligeti's quartet, which begins with this very interesting Latin ex abrupto, coming from nothing. I'm not meaning to say that Simon's copying Ligeti, but clearly you can see him being interested in it, taking note of certain things and the way that certain things are organized on the page, and most particularly the way the quartet relates to itself internally. It is very likely that he saw the score before he heard it played. Performances of this work in this country were not common for another 10 years or so. So it's likely he saw it. And I've put up, for instance, a page from the famous pizzicato mechanical movement, and just kind of keep that in your mind's eye now. You'll see that this kind of writing, these clouds of rhythms are layering on top of each other, 6 over 7 over 8 over 9, is something which, and all the idea of complicated rhythms creating a sort of morphing stasis, a mist, if you like, is something which was going to be very, very important for Simon. And it's first of all a place for us to say that one of the questions dealing with his music, which is always most interesting, is the question of how rhythm works, and I'm going to come back to that, and how the rhythm works with regard to structure and complexity. And the second, so the first score of the Ligeti would have been available from about 18 months before this piece was composed. And the other score of another work written pretty much at exactly the same time, which was of Lutosławski's solitary string quartet, written like the Ligeti quartet for the La Salle quartet. If you go to the very last 3 pages of score of the first quartet, and I've sent you in the email I sent you yesterday, I've sent you the link to the score of the first quartet. It's worth seeing it as it's a beautiful object in itself. Another thing to talk about is it's clear that this kind of shimmering overlay of a quartet effectively making a sort of an acoustic around one tonal center is something which is the result of looking at and maybe hearing Lutosławski's quartet, and crucially for Lutosławski's quartet, something which Bainbridge only does a little bit, is the idea of how things can float to and from each other. At one point in the middle of this quartet, you'll see on the score, if you just look into it, there's a moment where the cello and viola play what we call a box, repeating, rotating in one tempo, whilst the first violin and second violin float above it. Now, this is absolutely the kind of music which not just Lutosławski but Krzysztof Penderecki was writing, and to a lesser degree the third member of what used to be called the Polish school, Andrzej Ponównik, were producing, which was all to do with an idea of music which was not delineated vertically. And what's fascinating about all Simon's music is there's a real tension the whole time between how things line up vertically and how they don't. So, putting it bluntly, Simon often writes extremely complicated rhythmic intersections which are there specifically to make sure that the ear hears something which is dislocated. So the result of rhythmic complexity, such as if you look at this one page that I've got here from the Clarinet Quintet, the result of what you're looking at there is that the listener can't hear what's going on. Just to say that the second violin part there has been placed at the bottom of the line because there's not room for it between those two parts. And there's nobody who will be able to listen to that passage and tell where the pulse was. There isn't a pulse. And this is something which Bainbridge got from Ligeti, pulse being used as scaffolding rather than musical language of itself. But if we can just get back to Bainbridge's work, and maybe just even if you just look at this first page, one thing that this quartet establishes right from the get-go is that, like all of these works, it plays continuously, but it's punctuated by silence in many forms. And these are notated both within the music, either in kind of rhythmic notation. The obvious way, as you can see at the bottom of that first page, would be a silence which is notated as a quarter note in the top three parts and a quaver eighth note, a quaver at the bottom. But on top of that, you'll notice there is a comma, a breath marked before. And the interesting contradiction there, it's either notated that way, or if you look above, the line above, you'll see there are two different kinds of pauses, either simultaneously or not simultaneously, where the last note of the second marked bar on the second system is marked with a pause of fermata on the last note of the viola and second violin part, and there is a pause on the bar line for either everybody or for the cello and first violin. It's very ambiguous, and it's a very interesting question there. What does that mean, and what's the interlock between putting the pause on the bar line, which technically doesn't exist, and a pause on a note? Obviously, alongside this, these are all notated as either holds or pauses used as rest. So literally they are playing with musical substance using rhetorical devices. A fermata or a pause or a comma effectively is almost like a hand gesture telling you to stand still until the gesture is removed. But equally, Simon makes use all the way through his music of silences between sections which are notated by timed silences. So between this piece they range from 2 to 5 seconds. Well, that's always very interesting when you have a 2 to 5 second silence between a section or in a section, when your metronome mark is round about 60, as it is here. And you could almost say that the really fascinating thing is, even if you're playing exactly 60, any musician and any composer of any sensitivity will be able to be comfortable with the fact that 4 beats at 60 of silence is not the same, either in conceptually or in reality, as 4 seconds pause. It's a interesting and, for me, kind of fascinating thing to explore, and it's fundamental to what Simon is doing. As I mentioned earlier, even at this very early stage in his writing, and I think it's important, or perhaps not important, to remember that you're talking about a composer who had not turned 20 when he began this quartet. We're seeing a fascination which was going to be lifelong with both the nature and the experience of time, both from the composer's point of view, the player's point of view, and the listening point of view. And this nature and experience is both as an idea, what do we, effectively saying, the music asks us, what do we think about it, what do we feel about it? And there's also a fascination with it being used as a device. And all the works here are linked by many and multiple ways that we as listeners, players or composers experience or manipulate time passing or not, and how it manipulates us, and not forget that how it moves around the spaces that we play it in. It's worth saying that, just to go back to the question of publication again for a moment here, it's one thing that's been lost to a degree is the beauty of how music was being presented to us at this time. We're now become very accepting, with the exception of works which are expected to have wide purchase, which would be pieces written for children, for instance, or pieces written for popular instruments. We expect basically to be handed scores which are in generic covers. And what's interesting about the early 70s is that there was a period where even the most simple cover was a great deal of attention was paid to the design and how the design of the score related to the music itself. So to say the obvious thing here is that Simon's exquisitely handwritten score. There's no composer with more beautiful handwriting than Simon Bainbridge, and when he writes by hand, he always writes in a landscape score. And it's interesting to see how this landscape writing had inspired the designer for working for United Music Publishers to respond with a design which is deceptive in its simplicity. There's nothing simple about that. To get a score to look this good takes real thought and means that the designer has had a conversation either with the composer or with the publisher about what the nature of the music it is. And there's a real pleasure, as you can imagine, in getting a score like this. And I think that's something which has been lost. But just back to the music, which I hope by now you've had a chance to listen to more of. You can kind of dip in and out of it. Now, I mentioned that the other violin in the Kreutzer Quartet, Mihailo Trantofilovsky, is a fantastic composer. Do seek out his music if you can. He's written a huge amount of string music and extraordinary, for instance, works for a string quartet and choir. Writes a lot of microtonal music, but very much exploring the natural world. And talking to him the other day, he reminded me about, and this might sound an obvious thing to say, that as we explored this work in particular, and there's an amazing experience when, as a quartet, you sit and you find your way into a piece for the first time, that we literally were full of wonderment. And he said like this: every corner seems to be thought about, polished. Now that is a throwaway phrase, but that's something really wonderful. It's there in all of Simon's music, and this is part of the craft of what he does, is that alongside the excitement and the drama and the beauty of the ideas is an acute sense that he feels that everything should be presented in the most highly finished way. Even when Simon ends a phrase with a kind of dramatic tear off, it's always done with the same care which you might find in the detail on a piece of Chippendale furniture, or the refinements in one of the modern architects that Simon admires so much. As well as admiring the form and structure and materiality of architecture, it's very clear he also has great excitement about the detailing. And this is something which I know I come back to far too much, and it's there in all truly good art, is that there should be a dialogue and interchange between the purity and refinement of large structure and form and expression, and how this is either reflected or refracted in the fine detail that care over structure is reflected in care over presentation, and presentation is a broad term to use. But of course that means that as players, you then find yourself challenged to respond in a similar way. I'd say the equivalent would be, for instance, the responsibility, the terrifying responsibility we all feel when we face the work of someone like George Kurtag. And of course, it's also extraordinary to find such a young composer who, without wanting to be very dramatic, shows such an acute sensitivity to refinements of timbre. And of course, to pull this back to what I was just talking about, Simon's sensitivity to timbre, to texture, to colour, also is related to his acute sensibility as to the possible dialogues or relationships to many kinds of silences. It'd be very interesting to see what some of you think about what your experience of his use of silence will be. For instance, however you want to think of this in terms of what kind of refinements are you looking at, one of these, for instance, would be his approach to pizzicato, to snap pizzicato, Bartok pizzicato, which you hear snapping away at various times in the piece, all the way through to kind of finger tapping pizzicato, which it's clear that not only had Simon experienced this from its use in the Ligeti quartet I mentioned earlier, where it's taken to extreme degrees, but also as an English musician from its most famous use of very subtle pizzicato gestures in the famous orchestral thrumming, which is the underlay of the strings of the cadenza of Elgar's 1909 violin concerto. And alongside these pizzicato sounds, blending in and out of them are a variety of knocking sounds, from a finger trill on the belly of the instrument through to more dramatic sounds. So just to say what you're listening out for is obviously the snap pizzicato is this noise. Of course, even the very opening of the piece begins, that first page, with this very harsh kind of pizzicato, and it's interesting to think of the dialogue between fortissimo pizzicato to what looks like it's piano. When you play very high up the violin, in particular piano like that, the string is very rigid, so it's already got this kind of hard sound, and alongside those kind of pluck sounds and blend in and out of them, all kinds of knocking sounds. That first page again, finger trill on the belly of the instrument. Now, there's a poetic extension of these, which is how that relates to more, if you like, speculative ideas. And halfway through the piece, there's a moment where each player in turn plays material which is like this. Which is marked like a distant guitar. It's the only time in the piece where the composer uses a simile, and he uses it carefully. And I'd just like to leave that idea with you, that a technical instruction is one thing, a technical instruction allied to a simile is another thing. It invites us to use our imaginations. Now, I admit that quite a lot of this might seem the observation of rather shallow, sort of surface level detail relative to the piece as a whole, but I see this as analog to the use of decoration on a building. It's going back to the architecture thing I was just talking about. So, for instance, on a classical temple, each floral swag or a delicate frieze of acanthus leaves speaks to the nature of the architecture within. So if you walk out of this building, look at the decoration, if you're in the academy, look at the decoration on the outside of, for instance, York Gate, which is a building from 1817, roughly, and you'll see that the classical features of the building, the small decorations, are not merely they're not just playful, they speak to the essence of the building itself. So I'd like to move on now to 1993, to the Clarinet Quintet, which was commissioned by the Chelten Festival for the clarinetist Joy Farrell, who now teaches at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and my quartet, the Kreutzers. At that point, the members of the Kreutzer Quartet were my brother, Philip, the viola player, Philip Dukes, and the other violin we swapped were Cleo Gould. Joy had already worked this was the beginning of a collaboration between Joy and... Got to get this right. Joy had already worked closely with Simon on another work, with the oboe player Nick Daniel, who at that point was her husband, and he wrote an extremely complicated and brilliant double concerto for the two of them. For me, this was a very exciting first chance to work in depth with Simon, and that meant visiting his house in North London, in Kentish Town, where we could, he still lives there, sit outside in their lovely garden, it was in summer, and pore over the textures and colours and layerings of this extraordinary piece. Do make sure before you get to this that you either listen to me talk now, having listened to a bit of it, or you could even have the piece on as well and just drift in and out of it. It's a piece which takes a lot of listening to. You can't get the impression of it in the first time. It's very complicated, but it's also very, very orally alluring. And in our talks, Simon wanted to make one thing clear to me, that he wanted to put clear water, basically his approach to the medium of the quintet and the acclaimed quintets, obviously, of Brahms and Mozart. It's worth saying that at the various premieres of these pieces at Cheltenham and later on the South Bank, we played both those late quintets alongside Simon's piece. Now, the clearest manifestation of the distance which he wanted to make between his work was that he didn't want to allow the perceived perception of tessitura, the range of notes of the clarinet, to cut down what the quartet could do. So, for instance, if you know the Brahms quintet, the highest note in it, or the violin, is which it's done. It almost never happens. Brahms most of the time keeps the violin and the other instruments actually under wraps, if you like. He's going with the limits of Mühlfeld's clarinet. Simon kind of did the opposite thing, and he said, well, the clarinet's got to compete with the available timbre and ability to play quietly of the string instruments. And so he pushes all the players to the limits. And this is something about both this and the second string quartet, which is the case. Every single player is going to be pushed to the edge and over the edge of what is possible and impossible. This is not just in terms of complexity and altitude, if you can call it that, and the complex interrelationship between the parts and players, especially the rhythmic interrelationship, but also in terms of dynamics. So time after time in this piece, players, and especially the clarinet, find themselves, her part is outrageously challenging, find themselves aiming at extraordinary narrow targets. Like, for instance, the highest pitches will be allied to dynamics which are below or above achievable extremes. These will mean that a note will fail, and Simon's interested in how a note fails. Or you play so energetically, and you've listened to the strings in the last 3 minutes of the piece, you'll hear this, that not only do the instruments fail to be able to produce more resonance, there's a certain point where you keep scrubbing away at a violin or a cello or a viola, it effectively sort of just turns into into noise. And on top of that, and Simon also knows this, that particularly with the left hand, when you're playing these kind of for more than a couple of minutes, lactosis will set in and the hand will seize up. And this means that the player collapses, quite literally, and the piece collapses back to silence, the sort of stasis from which it emanates. And this is something which is of great interest to Simon. Now, one of the most striking things about this work and the experience of working with Bainbridge on it in '93 and much later. Oh, I want to say one thing before is that the one person who's in both this and the late quartet is pushed ridiculously hard is the cello, where there's always a moment where Simon will ask the cello to play a ridiculously expressive and lyrical recitative kind of passage in outrageously expressed two-part double stops, usually using extreme dissonance which push the hand into actually very painful combinations, a little bit like pushing something through a very, very narrow space. And there's this gesture is clearly something which he finds very, very important. I think the closest analogy would be, for instance, the pressure between, say, mudstone, which produces a vein of quartz. You don't get the quartz without the extreme pressure and the extreme heat. There's something about that in the way he treats the cello. But as I was going to say, one of the most striking things about this work and the experience of working with Bainbridge on it in '93 and much later is the relationship between rhythm and shape. Now, there's both as compositional tools and performance instruction. And these dialogue with his acute sensibility to architecture and to form in time, if you like, and the way we experience it. Now, for me, the simplest way to articulate this is to think about the relationship between the building and the bodies in a broader sense of the word who occupy it and experience it and move around it, work in it, breathe in it, live and die there. Now, it doesn't matter how sophisticated the form or the mathematics of that structure might be. So if you're talking about a building, whether it's the peristyle of a Bernini classical building or a stadium by Zaha Hadid, all of this kind of sophistication is in many ways moot until those bodies, and those bodies can be people or animals, or the bodies of air, light, of heat and cold, move around inside or outside the structure, both in reality and our imagination. So how is this manifested in the score? Well, at that point, the uninitiated, and I might be, and I certainly was at the time, and I'd worked with a lot of composers already, intimidated by the very complex demands of the overlayerings of complex rhythms, such as 3 triplet quavers in the time of 2 duplet quavers, or 7 in the time of 4, is a fairly simple example. What became clear is that once you work with Simon, as a result of all these sophistications, is that these are natural shapes of inhalation and exhalation, of the kind of move of an arm with the body at rest, or of an embrace, or rising and falling. And simple ways, if you briefly put a pulse behind it, often what he's interested in might be something, if I sing badly, something like a rhythm that comes across like this, which is shaped around the pulse but doesn't have any relationship to it. Its naturalness comes from the fact that it's expressed, for instance, as that one was kind of using displacements of 5 around a pulse, for instance. Now, what was really interesting was that in between 1993 and then working again with Simon on this piece in detail in 1918 onwards, was that he had come to realize that he wanted to impress upon us that as well as the freedom that these precisely notated materials already express, let me explain, that if you have a pulse, a slow pulse going, and you have something notated in 5 and 6 and 13, whatever, over the top of it, the result is that the listener can't hear any relationship between the rational rhythms and the pulse. That results in what can sound and should sound like rubato or freedom, or not even rubato, of free rhythm. But he wants, in addition to the freedom which comes from playing such rhythms precisely, he also wanted both the large and small forms to find their own life, that there should be both internal and external rubato and these on both large and small scale should reflect, mould, and even elide these structures. So the idea would be, say if we have that big pulse, and there's at no point in any of Simon's music where he, in these pieces anyway, where he writes a ritardando, he'll write a tempo change, say be from say like 70 into something a bit faster, and over the tempo change the rhythm might or might not be articulated in a way that you don't hear the tempo change in the pulse, but you hear it or not hear it in the rhythm. Most famous example of this would be in Alban Berg's lyric suite, where he makes a ritardando by writing a cellerando in the notated parts with the metronome mark getting slower and slower and slower and slower. Two, if you like, curves going so fast in the opposite direction from another one that it produces the opposite result from what might visually be expressed. But it also, so normally I would expect, as you would expect with say Ligeti's notation, that the big pulse, the tactus, doesn't change. But he revealed that he wanted all of the pulses, both the pulses of what were happening within the music and the pulse of the architecture of itself, to have freedom and breath. And that was very, very challenging. The equivalent would be, for instance, if you think of it in terms of tectonics, it would be, we might think of, say, if we perform a piece of music on a granite hilltop. The piece of music moves and the granite hilltop is static, but until we think about it, the granite hilltop 1 is on the Earth, which is rotating at X miles an hour, is crashing through the universe at many tens of thousands of miles an hour, or hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, according to how you measure it. And at the same time, the granite itself is subject to change of both geological change. It is in movement, just too slow for us to witness it. And that's a freedom, if you like. He's interested in those things. So he was very keen that every structure that he used, whether it was the structure, the scaffold itself, or that which was mounted on the scaffold, should have life, that would be autonomous and impacted by the most open range of influences and impressions. And this is something which is very exciting, was that he wanted the sensibility of every player to be conditioning the way that they shaped the music they played. So for instance, and this was a composer who did come up, if for instance at one point we all found a resemblance or a feeling not in the material but in the shaping of the material to the Liebestod from Wagner's Tristan, the most famous bit of expressive music of the 19th century in some ways, and the shaping of that. And he was very keen that we should pursue that. And you could say that extends through other influences, whether it's a play of light on the page of music while you're playing it, how air moves in the room, or the way the instrument itself feels or responds in the hand or the mouth. Everything is and should be fuel for the fire. I'd now like to move to the shortest piece of string chamber music that is written, a piece called Chelten Fragments, much later for another Cheltenham festival under another director, because it was commissioned by the festival to mark the composer Michael Barclay's 10 years as artistic director. This was premiered at the 2004 festival by the Arditi Quartet, and its title, Fragments, is an accurate description of what the listeners and players find when they open the part and approach the score as players. You basically, if you can see from the 2 pages I've shown you here, the music is a series of bits and pieces, stops and goes, fragments. It's quite interesting. This is your first encounter with Simon's music now turned into printed score. There are there are losses and gains. I'm not sure that the gains outweigh the losses, and it's also interesting seeing the music expressed in portrait format. I don't think it really works. I'd love to see this laid out in landscape. But let's go back to those fragments. Now, any player or group of players will bring their own ideas as to what such fragments might be. Now, for me, it might be the field of broken sculpture and kind of mosaic tesserae tiles from a book I don't expect you to have read. I only read it because I discovered it and fell in love with it. One of the great humanist works of the Renaissance, Francesco Colonna's 1504 Hypnerotomachia Porphyriae, which translates roughly as The Many Loves of One Who Dreams. And he wrote about a point in the book where the hero who's dreaming dreams a dream within a dream, and in that dream he finds himself in a field of broken pieces. And he says, admiring these beautiful fragments with much delight and pleasure, I was avid to search out new finds, and I roamed amongst them like some animal, all seeking better pasture over the heaps and ruins and huge columns, and some in pieces, others whole. Now back to Simon's work. That might sound obvious, but the essence of this work is that it is a collection of disparate, different, differing, and similar and not quite similar objects. There's no repetition in the piece, by the way. These feel as if they might be the remains, either broken, eroded, crumbling, of a larger structure. And there's always the question of what that larger structure was. You can think of, the most famous poem in English about a broken sculpture. I am Ozymandias, king of kings, look on my work, O you work mighty and despair, which is describing the broken base of a sculpture with just the feet on it. Shelley is inviting us, or not inviting us, to imagine the rest of the sculpture. Each of the musical objects in Simon's work utilizes a different arrangement of players, although all four are used in every one, and they group themselves in varying combinations, or you could call it loyalties. So you might get violin plus viola, or one duet next to second violin and cello, or violin and second violin and viola as a trio alongside the cello, or so on. You can, all of possible. So it's the kind of thing that Mendelssohn loved doing. If you spend time with a Hayate pen or a copy of the Mendelssohn Octet, you can see he basically uses around about 250 combinations of the 8 players. So there's various configurations of solos and duos and trios in Simon's piece. And it's worth saying that whilst there is no repetition, the fragments gradually kind of bulk up. Some of them are only 3 or 4 seconds long, and finally some of them become as long as 10-15 seconds long, and they become less tentative as the players and perhaps the listeners become more acquainted with the material. Now, about 3/4 of the way through the piece, and I do urge you to try and find this, violin and cello find themselves momentarily singing the same melody. Let me just dig one out for you. And the melody is this. So it's going. If I play the raw notes, which you hear with the cello playing very low, and the first violin playing it in harmonics. Now that might sound like not much, but in the context of this piece, that's a very, very substantive bit of material. Now this gesture of around about 2/3 of the piece, the first violin and cello finding themselves playing a lyrical melody in quite widely spaced octaves. What you're hearing there is 6 octaves apart, is the idea of a kind of super lyrical instrument. There are 2 ways, and this is one thing which I think is worth thinking about, is that when you encounter something like this, an example would be the huge melody which takes over the whole orchestra at the end of the Alban Berg concerto, where the violin is joined by another violin, then another violin, eventually the whole orchestra singing like a vast Puccini tenor. Now, it's not the same here, but there's a version of it, a kind of idea of extreme lyricism. And there's 2 things: either as it is in the Berg, that it is the very heart of the matter, or that it's something else, like if you know your Turner paintings, it's like a kind of distant glimpsed vista in a Turner landscape in an imagined Italian environment. But by the end of this piece, we are left with the sense that the elements have assembled themselves into a whole. But if you think about it, and I do hope you've taken the moment to listen to a bit of this, that whole may exist on the page or may exist in the room, but it mainly exists in the memory, in the sense of a dream fading in the morning, briefly coalescing as the work ends, and then being forgotten, like we forget a dream. Now it's interesting to think about what the function of fragments are. You can think of them as being protection. Shakespeare noted, "The body of your discourse is sometimes guarded with fragments." And I think that might be a way of understanding what Simon is doing here, and the meaning, the singing quality of this discourse, to misquote Shakespeare, is all the more dutiful for it. And let's move now to the second quartet, the most substantial work that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about it quite briefly, actually. Now, we came to work on this piece in 2018 and gave our first performance of it the following year in the Dupré building in Oxford. You can see a live stream version of that performance. I'll put the link in. I invited to play this piece because we were told that there'd been some issues with the fact that the quartet who had been commissioned for in America had not played it, and then another quartet had played it and not really had the chance to work with Simon, so it was sitting there as a bit of an orphan. And of course, naturally, when we found out that there was a major work from Simon four-string quartet, as we leapt on this. And this led to a period of very intense work with the composer, resulting in some of the kind of conversations I've been talking about, and all the other works that actually drove us back to the other pieces. And also the most important thing, and it's worth saying to all of you who play chamber music, that gave us the chance to explore the work in depth as a group. And I think it's very easy to think about rehearsal and exploration in the pressure to work on something in order to prepare it for performance. Sometimes what can be lost is the sense of discovering it, like you might discover, imagine discovering the unknown cave paintings of Lascaux, for instance, or Fleming. I don't want to overstate this, but why not? Discovering penicillin. That these things are only discovered if you do things which are not really so formal. They're not designed to an end. They're literally trying stuff out. And we had the opportunity to do that both as a group and with Simon. And he wanted to point out very much that one of the aspects of this work which was very important to him was his encounter with visual art. He wrote, "I've always been influenced by art, possibly because my parents were both artists, and will often go to an art gallery to find inspiration or solutions to musical problems or sticking points. A combination of colour, shape, design, texture, perspective, drama in a painting will inevitably engender a counterpart in a musical landscape in my head, which will begin to unfold given the visual impetus of a great work of art." Now, in this piece, this process of unfolding, if we use that word, is mirrored by the form and realization of the piece. Like all the works, it's in one continuous movement, but unlike the others, is dominated by energetically wrought rapid material, which is either very fast music, like you'll hear in the end, or complex figuration, which move quickly in static or slow-moving environments, the kind of whizzing figures at the beginning. This kind of material, but happening in a held chord, which is fast music in stasis. Now, this kind of complex overlaying, which in many ways may reach back to that idea I talked about at the beginning of him using different floating musics, not rhythmically notated, floating in time moving or time still. But this overlaying was very much inspired by the work of the Ethiopian-born American artist Julie Meritu. The composer writes, "The first time I encountered the artist Julie Meritu's work, I was irresistibly drawn in a labyrinth of radiant colours and textures, which, when they're seen from different perspectives, caused the musical environment to unfold in my head." Now, from my point of view, reflecting on the experience of studying, collaborating, rehearsing, performing, and producing this work, the notion which comes to mind now is a kind of post-Nietzschean thing, the idea of perspectivism. The idea that everything changes constantly according to how we're viewing it at any particular time and space. So, for instance, if the most common experience we would have would be what a landscape looks like if you're going past it in a train. And if you extrapolate that into the early 20th century, Einstein's idea of what would the world look like if I rode on a beam of light. And of course, famously, he came up with that idea from the experience of riding on a tram and looking at the world from a tram, and his sense that things would look different as you went past them. And So if we're talking about Bainbridge and Meritu, I think it's more useful to talk about points in time and space, as the one thing their work both demands is that the listener or player or viewer imagine and finds themselves on various planes and points at the same time. In the case of Simon's music, this means that often we'll start to doubt our perception, for instance, of fast and slow, up and down, loud and soft. And a creative slippage is integrated into every quality that might normally be experienced in a binary context. Those binaries, up and down, loud and soft, now kind of overlayer each other, infect each other, cross-fertilize. I said that I was going to draw attention to a big parallel between Bainbridge's work and something which might have influenced him earlier, and that actually links to this idea of things changing as you look at them. In the center of this piece, you'll find there is a big 2.5, 3 minute passage of basically all the quartet playing material that kind of does is. Which is notated in a variety of rhythms overlaying, so you get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. This, if you look at a page of this and then go back to that page from the Ligeti Second Quartet that I mentioned earlier, it's clear that this idea, this image that Ligeti had established with it, which then became absolutely fundamental to what many composers did afterwards, is something which gives us an insight into the way that Bainbridge sees and hears and imagines. But Mihailo Transvolowski noted that what is common in all the pieces, but most crystallized in the second quartet, is something terribly important to Mihailo, which is a sense of energy, the thing which drives the evolution of each individual piece. And not only drives the evolution of each piece, but drives the development of all Simon's music, which is, you can see a piece of music as being divided into its constituent elements, which tells you something about how it's developed or shaped itself. And then if you put that music alongside other pieces of music, either viewed or not viewed in chronological order, that development from A to B in a piece and from A to B in a composer's life, these two map onto each other in an interesting way. You could argue that from birth to death maps onto the beginning and end of a piece of music. So there's a clear, powerful analogy there, which is in common with everything we do in the arts. And the first performance of the work in Oxford, and you can see this on the web link which I put in this YouTube video. It's on the bottom. That's the link to the film. Images by Meritu were projected behind us, and these increased, for me anyway, the sense of floating in a kind of morphing web of texture and colour and trajectory, emotion, ideas and conversations. In such sensitized circumstances, it's inevitable that the listeners, the audience, become part of the process, increasing the sense which is vital to Michael's music, to Simon's music, that we are all in this together, something we're all thinking about rather often at the moment. This is whether in the influence of a movement scene from the stage, you see some of the audience doing something and it affects what you do, to the sense of shared breathing, which is fundamental to music shared, that we feel the audience alive, if you like, or in the kind of release of applause, the celebration after a precisely notated 6 seconds of trilling, hovering pianissimo, which is how this piece ends. Now, from where I sit, there's no question about it. Bainbridge is a kind of magician, a mage, and no amount of study of these incredibly sophisticated scores, and I use the word very carefully, nor time spent at the practice desk studying them with the instrument, or in the rehearsal room with colleagues, or even with the composer, none of these can prepare us for the spell that he casts and the music casts when these pieces are played and heard and seen in the broadened sense together. So that brings me to the end of what I wanted to say. If you've got anything you want to ask, please copy me into, write to me in the email that if you have from the Academy. and it will be interesting to see how this dialogue develops. Thank you very much.